I have the pleasure of starting the meeting today to introduce you to this long night of research session run by the Global Migration Lab. We are here today to talk about the lab's research on trust in humanitarian assistance and to showcase academic research linked to volunteering. My name is Sanushka Mudliar. I'm the director of the Global Migration Lab, and I'm your host today as we discuss opportunities and challenges in utilising a volunteer-based model to undertake research on migration. It's fabulous to have you all here, and we're very excited for the conversation and the presentation today. Today, we're going to hear from colleagues from the Honduran Red Cross, the Argentine Red Cross, Australian Red Cross, and also here at the Global Migration Lab on how to harness the strength of the Red Cross and Red Crescent volunteer network to conduct research on migration. We're very grateful to each and every one of our colleagues for joining us today and for the ongoing support of their national societies to the work of the Global Migration Lab. And we're also, as I said, very excited to have you all here. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land in Sydney, where the lab works and where we all live, and pay my respects to elders past and present. For those joining us from overseas, this acknowledgement of country is a mark of respect to the traditional custodians of this land and a recognition of the continuing connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to the country in this place we call Australia. So before we go any further, let me introduce the speakers to you today. Milena, actually, could I ask you to do the introduction of speakers so that I can share my screen?
Let me introduce our speakers today. We have Sanushka, who's the director of the lab, and she will be hosting the session. We also have Carlos Torres joining us from La Cruz Roja Hondureña. Tenemos a Felipe Hernández Díaz. We have, I'm really sorry, I'm going to start again. I just realized I'm doing complete Spanglish because I'm used to speaking in the two languages. So we have Carlos Torres from the Cruz Roja Hondureña, Felipe Hernández Díaz from the Cruz Roja Argentina, Jenny Gillett joining us from Australian Red Cross, myself, Milena Arias from the Global Migration Lab, and my colleague Sanushka Mudliar from the Global Migration Lab as well. And we will be just hearing reflections and perspectives on all of our colleagues on conducting research with volunteers on migration research. So thank you so much for joining us today. Sanushka, I'll give the mic back to you.
Thank you. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, the Red Cross Red Crescent Global Migration Lab, which we refer to as the lab, is a recent initiative of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And the lab was created to support the movement's efforts to build a world in which all people who cross international borders are treated humanely and with dignity. As some of you may know, the movement has a long history of assisting, protecting and advocating for the most vulnerable, including through the work of the International Federation of the Red Cross, the International Committee, and numerous international Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world. Crucially, the movement approaches migration from a purely humanitarian perspective, aiming to respond to the humanitarian needs of migrants, including refugees, without seeking to encourage, discourage, or prevent migration. The lab was established to channel the power and potential of the movement into the creation of alternatives to existing migration laws and policies that alleviate human suffering around the globe, and in particular to build upon the unique approach of the movement in the international system of migration governance, which is that we provide assistance and protection to everyone who is in need, regardless of their legal status. We work closely with Red Cross and Red Crescent organisations from the local to the global level to conduct research to ensure that the voices, expertise and lived experience of migrants is amplified to guide and inform migration and humanitarian policy and operations. Our flagship report on COVID-19 and access to basic services for migrants was used in 2021 and 2022 to influence global policy discussions and humanitarian diplomacy. And our latest report, the one that we're going to discuss in this session today, is on migrants' trust in humanitarian action. For this project, the movement's migration leadership group, which is senior levels of movement organisations across the world, commissioned research to understand the perspective of migrants on the humanitarian assistance they've received. It was conceived as both an exercise in evaluation and understanding community perspectives on the work of the movement, as well as an attempt to project the voices and lived experience of migrants into the global debate around restrictive migration policies. This project involved research with over 16,000 migrants across 15 countries and will inform the work of the movement's operations as well as our humanitarian diplomacy. So if we go to the next slide, a key part of the work of the lab involves collaborations with national societies, such as those that are participating in the call today. We're just going to play you a short video that explains our work.
Migrants cross borders for a range of reasons, either by choice or in response to events beyond their control. Many face risks to their safety, well-being, and dignity during their journeys. Through diverse teams of local volunteers and staff, many of whom have lived experience of migration, the Red Cross Red Crescent assists and protects people in vulnerable situations around the world. Here at the Global Migration Lab, we work with these local teams to listen to and learn from the expertise and experience of migrants and communities. We connect Red Cross Red Crescent data, operational insights, and technical knowledge from the field and transform it into evidence-based research. From the local to the global level, our findings help policies and programs respond to the needs and recommendations of migrants and communities. Our research also informs a variety of humanitarian operations, from immediate life-saving assistance to longer-term resilience programming, with the ultimate goal to alleviate human suffering, protect life and health, and promote respect for the dignity of all people, no matter where they're from or why they've moved. To find out more about the Global Migration Lab, visit our website.
Okay, I'm going to pass back to you to share the screen, Louise. And to get the conversation started, I'm going to ask Milena, who is the research officer who works closely with colleagues from national societies on behalf of the lab, to talk a bit about volunteering in the context of research of the lab. Milena comes from an academic background and has previously worked in multiple prestigious universities, and she's helped us bring academic rigour to our work, as well as bringing with it an insight into community perspectives based on the research that she's conducted in the past. So Milena, can I ask you to explain to us how volunteers are engaged in the research of the lab? What are some of the challenges and opportunities in engaging volunteers in research? And what are some of the lessons you have learned in this area? Thank you, Milena.
Thanks, Anushka. And fingers crossed, no more technical issues going forward. Thanks to all of you for your patience. So as the video show, we work through a model of research collaboration where colleagues from different components of the movement are involved in each step of our research. And today, myself and many of our colleagues are going to be talking mostly about our experiences doing research as part of the Trust project that Anushka briefly mentioned. And this was a large collaboration with colleagues from IFSC, RCRC, and 15 participating national societies, including colleagues from La Cruz Roja Hondureña, La Cruz Roja Argentina, and Australian Red Cross. And just to provide some background to those of you that aren't familiar with the project, this was quite a large research project where we collected interviews, focus groups discussions, and face-to-face and online surveys in 15 countries in Africa, the Americas, Europe, and the Asia Pacific. And the main idea of the project was really to listen to the thoughts, the fears, the doubts, and the experiences of migrants about the situations they are living and the humanitarian assistance and protections they receive. And volunteers couldn't be more essential to our work. On the one hand, at the lab, we have had a wonderful team of corporate volunteers and Red Cross volunteers supporting our work with all aspects of research, from volunteers working in administration to an amazing team of research assistants that assist us with desk research, to data analysts that assist us with the analysis of large quantitative surveys. On the other hand as well, many of our colleagues from national societies who work tirelessly really collecting all these surveys, all these interviews, they also collaborate quite closely with volunteers on their own countries. So this is really a reflection of what has happened both with us at the lab, but also with colleagues and volunteers in other countries. And my reflection is really more in the context of migration research and international migration research. So first, talking about kind of the opportunities, the positive things, the advantages. One of the great advantages that we have by engaging with volunteers in all these national societies is that we are able to gain global insights into what is truly a global phenomenon. So as some of you may know, the majority of academic and policy debates on migration are still happening within the boundaries of one country. And the main challenge with this is that this research with a national framework obscures the fact that migration is actually a global phenomenon, and that we cannot really understand what is happening in one country without understanding what is happening in the region and in the rest of the world. So in a way, one of the strengths of the lab is that by collaborating with Red Cross national societies, by collaborating with volunteers, we have an ability to do research in extremely diverse countries. So we're able to collect data in countries of origin, transit, destination, global north, global south, different regions. So we're able to see similarities and differences between the countries, but we're also able to identify issues of global humanitarian concern, which I think is really important. Another one of the opportunities or the advantages is the perspective and the inclusion that we gain from this collaboration. Because research is, to a degree, all about perspective. So one would expect that researchers would always talk to people in other countries, to locals, to migrants about the research. But in practice, this doesn't always happen. We still have a lot of inequality in terms of funding, in terms of who does the research, who writes the findings. So one of the strengths of doing this research is that we must consult with national societies, and that national societies, even the volunteers, feedback into different stages of the research. So we have that very local perspective and that enriched perspective of people that are on the ground. In practical terms, an amazing advantage of working with volunteers is the wealth of knowledge and skills that they have. So a simple, but I think quite powerful example is language. So for the trust research, we had volunteers doing interviews and surveys in Arabic, English, French, Spanish, Sinhala, Tamil, Somali, Swedish, Finnish, Turkish, Dibehi, Bambara, Setswana, and many more languages, meaning that we could access a really large and diverse groups of migrants. And that's really quite unique. Another example are the technical skills that many volunteers of the Red Cross, Red Crescent already have. And we found that in at least half of the countries we were working in, volunteers were already skilled in collecting quantitative data through tools such as Kobo Collect, which was amazing because you have this really skilled force that are able to collect data in extremely diverse places. And finally, and perhaps more importantly as well, is that we also have the privilege of working with volunteers that have a lived experience of migration. So for instance, in the case of Finland, migrant volunteers play an essential role in supporting the collection of data. And this brings me to the fourth advantage that is related to scope, to reach, and to access, which the fact is that migrants, and particularly migrants in vulnerable situations, can be difficult to reach for really reasonable reasons. Because of the conditions under which they migrate, because of the conditions under which they live. There may be fear about being seen, there may be fear about being interviewed, there may be fear about sharing their data. And here is where the connections of volunteers to migrants and local communities are so essential and so beneficial to research. So as in the example I gave in Finland, it was really through the work of volunteers who already had a connection and a deep understanding of the communities that we were able to reach participants in vulnerable situations. So I guess those are some of the opportunities, those are some of the amazing advantages we have, but then there's also some challenges. And I'm conscious of the time here, so I might skip one of the challenges, but one of the key things is the need to build volunteer capacity. Because, well, our volunteers have a lot of skills, and I'm sure Jenny, Felipe, and Carlos will reflect on this. The majority of our volunteers are not trained researchers. So this creates a risk not only to the quality of the research, but also to our relationship with communities. So to address any potential vulnerability of migrants, but also and to ensure that the research is conducted in a manner that is successful, that is sensitive, that it emphasizes respect, we provided training in topics such as research ethics, tools, and methods. And we also had sessions on the minimum protection approach to all participating national societies. A challenge here as well is language, because to reach national societies, we had to provide training sessions in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. And that is a really good step, but at the same time, it's not enough because some colleagues are not native speakers in those languages. So we also provided training resources, notes, and guides in these languages. And here's again where some of our volunteers were amazing because they were able to translate those notes and those sessions into 4 languages. I might skip the issue of bias because of time, but I think something that is a challenge is also the need to respect the existing relationships that volunteers have with migrant and local communities. The key principles of research ethics are respect, merit, integrity, justice, and beneficence. And I don't have time to go into research ethics now, but research ethics is really about the relationship between the participant and the person doing the research. And a significant difference when you work with volunteers is that volunteers are not fly in, fly out consultants. They are value members of the communities who have relationships, who have respect, who are neighbors, who are friends, who are relatives. So we need to make sure that our research and our work really follows those principles, that there is respect, that there is integrity, that there is justice, that there is beneficence, so that those relationships between our volunteers and the communities are not damaged or compromised by doing research. And finally, and I'm sure as well, my other colleagues will talk about this, is how we provide ongoing support and coordinated support to our volunteers. So at the lab, we can do some things. We can do some things with the national societies we work with on migration. But I think as a movement, there is a need for a larger coordinated approach. And this is a really good opportunity to think about this, how we provide volunteers with ongoing support to engage in research in a manner that is beneficial to them, to the communities they work with, and to the broader work of the organization. So as I said, I'm mindful of the time, so I will let Carlos, Jenny, and Felipe also speak about some of these issues, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Milena. That provides a good starting point to dive into the experiences of the national societies that worked with us on the trust research in their engagement with volunteers. So I'd like to now give the floor to Carlos, who not only has extensive experience in issues related to planning and strategy, but was also the focal point for the trust research in Honduras. And Carlos, I know you're keen to talk with us about some of the practical things like how you managed recruitment of volunteers, but we're keen to hear about your experience more generally. Thank you. Over to you, Carlos.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be able to share this experience with you. It was of great satisfaction for us as a national society for all the work that we perform in terms of migration. Can you hear me fine so far? I just wish to convey somewhat the recruitment of volunteers. For us as a national society, we identified active volunteers that have participated in other processes to raise information. And also because these were very sensitive issues. In Honduras, this is a country in which we have transit from many countries, migrants crossing from Panama, they arrive to Nicaragua, and then they go to Honduras. They come from South America, Africa. Therefore, the issue was to select volunteers with a high level of skills to be able to talk with them and to be open-minded in that sense. In Honduras, we have migrants throughout the whole country. So we selected volunteers from the 4 regions that we have to facilitate the logistics. We had volunteers in the north, south, east, and west of our country. As a national society, we have a monitoring and assessment unit, and we have 25 volunteers trained in that unit. Therefore, we took the volunteers in that unit, and that was a way to recruit that ensured to obtain good information, because we had those volunteers with that level of information raising capacity. I'm clear that we all had good learning with the volunteers. The Migration Lab allowed us so because we had raised satisfaction or the humanitarian aid provided to the migrant, but to create groups with the migrants for us was an extremely good experience. The lab brought us that experience of how to reunite or gather the migrants to be able to gather information. We hadn't done that before. It had always been done individually and with a focal group that was extremely interesting. We hadn't done so before, and that allowed us to have a good learning how to develop this and the whole training process to analyze data. And for us, we have that experience, but at the same time, we were able to obtain that information from the viewpoint of migrants, how to rescue this, how to portray this. I'm sorry for how fast I'm talking, but I know that time is highly appreciated. So we had challenges, the language, of course, many people that came from Africa. So how were we able to understand? That was also a challenge for us that was extremely large. And also the time zones, Honduras, Australia, for the whole communication. It was also a challenge for us. And an additional one that is extremely important that we should write down in our books is the information of migrants who have returned. Those in transit are very open-minded, they wish to receive help and so on, but the returning migrant has a mess of a life. They don't want to say a word, they don't want to share. So that's the challenge. How do we gather information from a returned migrant? That I feel could be extremely important for the Migration Lab or for future information collection. I think that to work with returned migrants can also help. I also wish to mention this was a good opportunity, the whole training process to gather information, the data analysis, the exchange with the volunteers from other societies nationally, that also allowed us to be able to get to know others, which was also fruitful. Based on the participation of the project, we were able to go through lessons learned from the returned migrants, how to differentiate them, how to identify who to talk to, how to do so. As a national society, we have a center of the returned migrant, and that's the only place where we were able to gather this information. It was limited information as such, or not very open. So it would be important to stop on that and to understand how to further collect information. And the migrants that go through every country, it's a lesson learned. Honduras, based on where we are, we have 1,000 or 1,500 per day. We understand for the returned migrant around 800 daily. It's an exaggerated amount, so it's also good to analyze and to bear in mind the agreements of the amount of migrants that go through the country. And to finish, This is also an issue on how to work with research on childhood, on child migrants with all the protection protocols and what is related to it. In the future, it would be good to identify how to carry out that research of the migrant childhood, because their parents are also migrating with their children or mothers. So it's a pleasure to be able to share this with you, and any questions, we are readily available.
Thank you so much, Carlos. It's fabulous to hear about the scope and scale of the work that you did, and the intricacies of trying to manage such a large pool of volunteers in, as you say, a complex environment with ethical issues in engaging with the communities that we were seeking to gather data from. We will get to questions at the end of the session, but for now, I want to give the floor to Jenny, who has a wealth of knowledge on issues related to policy and research on migration, to talk about some of the experiences of the Australian Red Cross as part of this research project.
Thank you, Sanushka, and thank you, Carlos, for that insight, a little bit of an insight into what has happened for you in Honduras with this research. It's great to have this opportunity to speak with you all today, to represent Australian Red Cross and to learn other national societies' experiences as well. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which I'm on. I'm actually in a small city in the southern part of Australia on the lands of the Boandik people, the First Nations people of this area. And so I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I've got a couple of slides here to firstly talk about our experience with the trust research, and then to talk a bit more about our experience working with researchers and volunteer researchers in Australian Red Cross. And hopefully when you look at this first slide, those three categories, recruitment, training, and implementation, don't seem particularly surprising. What we found with this experience of trust research, firstly, really positive experience, and absolutely delighted to see the final report when it was published and to have opportunity to use that report in our advocacy domestically. In order to go about conducting this research domestically, what we needed to do was identify the volunteers and people who were able to help. And it sounds like, Carlos, you had a pool of people already available to you. It wasn't quite the same in Australia. We needed to firstly understand who was able to volunteer with us, identify those volunteers, and that involved its own internal process. We needed to make sure that the volunteers were armed with the tools, resources, and information that they needed to be able to conduct the research appropriately, linking to what you said, Milena, about training for volunteers so that they're skilled to be able to do the work and empowered to do it as well. And making sure that the process of doing the research, through the process of doing the research, they were maintaining that quality standard of research so that there's consistency and rigor from an academic perspective in the results that were being produced, but also that they were sensitive to the needs of the people they were speaking with to ensure that there was no harm caused by conducting the research itself. So that was quite a large sort of practical side and considerations that we had to take into account when we're working with the volunteers and training. And then through the actual implementation itself, I mean, firstly, a huge thanks to the lab for the resources. Obviously, from an academic perspective, it's very helpful to have consistent resources across the whole research pool internationally, but domestically, it certainly saved us a lot of time. Another thing with the implementation process is looking at the process of interviewing clients. And within Australia, we were very keen to ensure that clients were reimbursed for their time, and those interviews took place in an appropriate manner for the clients themselves. And we also wanted to make sure the volunteers had opportunity to feed back to us about their experience as working as a volunteer on this program, on the project. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, the process wasn't without challenges, and we took quite an agile approach to this. And one of the first challenges we had was looking at our internal processes. Australia is quite a large country. We have quite a large migration support program in existence that's very successful and helps a lot of migrants across the whole country. It's worth recognising that the majority of migrants in Australia see Australia as a point of final destination. And so that context is helpful. And so we do have clients who receive support from us over a range of different programs. And that means that we have the means to be able to reach out to them, again, to make contact to see if they were interested in being involved in this research project. Prior to doing that, we needed to make sure that we had Red Cross on board, and we needed to work with our state and territory leads and people in each state and territory to make sure that they felt they had the capacity to support the project and to support the volunteers conducting the research in the area. So there was a little bit of internal work to get the whole organisation on board to understand the purpose behind the research and what we hope to achieve from it. We also have a volunteer hub. So there's across all of Red Cross, across all the different programs, there's volunteer specialists who help with the recruitment of volunteers. And so we needed to work with them to make sure that when we were recruiting volunteers to this particular process, we were following all of our internal needs. For example, every volunteer needs to have a police check. Every volunteer needs to be registered with us and needs to have conducted an interview to be a volunteer. So there's processes involved in actually identifying who we could recruit to be the volunteers. And because of time pressures, what we found was that we actually needed to only provide this opportunity for the trust survey to people who were already existing volunteers in other programs. So in some ways that limited the pool of people who were able to get involved. I'll cover later what we've done to try and overcome that in the future. What we found was that we received a handful of applications for volunteers who were interested in doing this work, and there was excellent quality. They were really enthusiastic and highly committed. So despite the timeframes and some of the limitations around that, it did actually turn out to be a good result because it meant we had a small pool of people who we were able to work with really closely. And there were also practicalities around the timeframes in terms of lead-in times to prepare for the interviews, to prepare for the group conversations. We needed to give clients opportunity to firstly say they'd like to be involved, and then secondly, have time to come along to those events and to engage in that way. I'm certain that if we had more time, more lead-in time, we certainly would have been able to engage more migrants, but in the same way, also very happy with the results we were able to attain and the quality. Some of the statements that migrants provided are absolutely beautiful and provide such valuable insights. We also had learnings along the way around the survey questions and local nuances. And Carlos, you mentioned language. Milena, you also mentioned languages. And similarly in Australia, there were a range of languages that people needed to be engaged in. And also when we're looking at how language is used, just making sure that really simple English, if it is English that's being used, is provided in the questions. So the volunteers did need to work through some of the practicalities around the survey questions and local nuances around how to frame the questions to get the answers that the migrants, that were most appropriate for the migrants for that question. And I think in that it helped that we had a small pool of volunteers, so there was consistency across how questions were being asked. I've touched on the client recruitment, and so we were able to reach out to some people who had previously received Red Cross support and through other means as well. What we recognized through this process was the importance of client consent. And we had previously been undertaking some work within migration support programs to ensure that whenever a client receives Red Cross services in whatever program it's in, the client is able to decide if they wish to be contacted in the future around research. And so there were some programs where we knew which clients we could reach out to, but it really highlighted the opportunity that we've got to ensure that all our programs consistently ask clients when they first sign up, are you interested in being contacted in the future? And that's really important because it gives us a greater pool of people to reach out to, but also it means that we're ensuring, again, looking at the do no harm and confidentiality in respect of the client, that we're using their data and their information appropriately. We also wanted to make sure that the client was reimbursed if they chose to participate in the research itself, which again, simple in principle, but in practice, it required us talking with our finance team, checking out what the process is internally, identifying the budget to be able to reimburse the client. And so there were some administrative things we needed to do in the background to make sure we were set up to conduct the research. And finally, capacity and report writing. There was so much information that was produced within the Australian study, and it's a gold mine in an English phrase. And so what we really are looking to do is publish a domestic report, because that will sit alongside the global report, and we can use that in our domestic advocacy to explain to government and decision makers the importance of taking a global perspective and of understanding what trust means to people in Australia, migrants in Australia. But developing a report takes time, and it takes resources, and it also takes skill. And so I think it's important to build into the process of recognition that research is on a continuum, and there's always more you can do and different ways we can use the information and present the information to have the greatest impact. Next slide, please. What we've done, and I'll whip through the next 3 slides because I know I'm conscious of time. What we've done since is we've actually looked at developing a pool of research volunteers so that people can engage and we can overcome some of those hurdles around needing to have people ready for when volunteer opportunities come up, research opportunities come up. So we've recruited volunteer research officers, and you'll see here in the picture the importance of also not just recruiting people, but training people and supporting people to understand some of the special ways that Red Cross talk and we work. And so we've invested a fair amount of time into talking about humanitarian diplomacy, talking about the fundamental principles, talking about and discussing as a group why we speak in some ways and we don't speak in other ways. We've created opportunities for researchers to share their experience with each other and have peer-to-peer learning and partner on projects together so they can develop their own understandings together. What we asked for research was a commitment of up to 8 hours a month, so around 2 hours a week. So hopefully not a huge commitment. And what we found was we got a wealth of applications from people. And if you could pop to the next slide as well, please. We had applications from people who identified as migrants, people identified as refugees, from people with PhDs, highly qualified researchers from quantitative and qualitative backgrounds, people who are currently undergoing maybe a master's degree, or people undertaking an undergraduate degree. So very qualified, very experienced people. Many people had or have qualifications in their country of origin or other countries they've been to en route, so they're not necessarily recognized qualifications in Australia. And that's really important as well, because what we're saying through allowing this opportunity, creating this opportunity for researchers to be involved with us, is that it's about your skills and your knowledge that's valuable, not necessarily a piece of paper. And so they may be going through a process of getting their qualifications recognized in the Australian system for their professional needs, and in the interim they can still engage in something they really enjoy and be connected in that way to the work of Red Cross. I did find it interesting when you look at the percentages there that the majority of research volunteers actually are migrants, compared with a pool of advocacy volunteers who've also come on board, and the majority of them are not migrants to Australia. I'll just highlight the quote there. And I think it highlights the importance of creating opportunities for volunteers to be engaged in research, especially in research around migration. And that's that inclusion and feeling part of a society is central to health and well-being. And it seems no matter what visa type, arrival mode, gender, history, age, etc., it is difficult to feel included in society on arrival and within the first couple of years. And that for me really is the opportunity that we create by making sure we provide avenues for people to engage in research with us as a volunteer.
Thank you so much, Jenny.
There is one more slide. I'll just quickly summarize just to say there are so many opportunities. There are so many opportunities. I won't go through them, but very much look forward to working with the lab and other research institutions as well on developing some of these global resources. And to note that the global research in Australia has been hugely valuable because we can use it to discuss with government global trends. And sometimes it's useful in disarming and saying, this isn't just a problem in Australia, this is actually happening everywhere, and these are some of the solutions. But thank you, Sanushka.
Thank you so much, Jenny. It's interesting from listening to the different presentations that one of the most fundamental things that's coming out is about the structures that need to be put in place in order to facilitate volunteer involvement. So there's the practicalities and that the intention to involve volunteers needs to be combined with planning. And it's interesting to see the sort of systems that Carlos spoke about, as well as the ones that you've spoken about, Jenny, and the commonalities and differences between contexts. So finally, let me pass to Felipe. Felipe is the National Coordinator for Human Mobility and Migration at the Argentine Red Cross. And the Argentine Red Cross has been a strong supporter of the lab's work and a champion in advocating the value of evidence-based research to support the work of the movement more broadly. Please, I invite you to share your reflections with us, Felipe.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, Magdalena and Sanushka and everyone that's part of Migration Lab. As Sanushka said, I am the national coordinator for the human mobility and migration programs. Specifically, we work pretty hard in the northern part of the country when it comes to the borders with Bolivia, Paraguay, and Brazil. In those two regions, we decided to focus the work that was carried out at the time when we survey data that we've been working on last year. Maybe one of the main challenges when it comes to the work that we did with our volunteers so as to work in migration. Well, on the one hand, there's a research challenge, right? To find profiles that would focus on research and investigation. But it's not only that, it is also trying to integrate different profiles that may not necessarily have to do with that. Because then again, you know, our motto is that if you want to become a volunteer, you don't need to be specifically trained or have a professional career. So how can we integrate those volunteers that are really keen on working with these populations, of vulnerable populations? So I think it's very interesting to try and understand that you can work with these communities at different levels, okay? We can be fully engaged and, you know, we can also conduct surveys, or we can maybe try and ID parts of that population or communities, or recognizing that community, which is something that we did with the focus groups and the surveys that we did in order to count the people that we had. I mean, in the work that we do, there's always, we try to basically call everyone at a national level, especially all of the organizations that have been working with humanitarian aid and have been working for us for long. Then we start the process for recruitment and training so that those volunteers are actually aware of what we expect from them and what we expect to achieve. Then, if we talk about a different aspect, maybe the achievements of the research, I think it was very important for us to be able to work with Migration Lab, because it actually allowed us to register some changes and work dynamics and how people on migrants actually understood the work that was actually being carried out, which also in turn allowed us to find possibilities to transform our programs with which we've been working in the communities, especially because the program of the Red Cross Argentina was born in 2019. And because of these really high flow of Venezuela migration to Argentina, that survey at the time allowed us to see that the situation that we were catering for in 2019, with those really high flows of migration to Argentina and other countries of Latin America, was actually in transformation, and the needs were no longer the same. And so that actually forced us to transform our initiatives and programs in order to better assist this coming population with our humanitarian aid. So first that, but then also, try to identify the degree to which this migrant population was getting the information regarding the humanitarian services that we or other organizations could offer. This information is not always clear. And in the end, the actual voice of the person and what the person actually has to say allows us to understand that sometimes people don't get the information the way we intend them to. With regards to some of the support that we think might be needed or the challenges that we have looking forward at aiding these migrant populations, I think although we're constantly working in training processes with our volunteers and the different areas of the civil society, we have identified that maybe the area or the topics for research are not, I would say, and something that's very embedded in our Red Cross in Argentina. And we think that is definitely an opportunity with the volunteers at a national level. So for example, when it comes to, methodology of research or ways of surveying information and registering the data, because those are not issues that we're constantly working on. And I think they're actually very important in order to see and learn actually from the work that we do every day. Right? A while ago, a few months ago, when we were trying to systematize all of the information from migration area, we realized that there was so much that could be done, so much that could be analyzed from what was done these past 4 years, but we don't really take the time to literally standardize and systematize that information, and we're losing an improvement opportunity on what we're currently working on. So we believe that looking forward, or even, at a short or at a long term, we need to work on research itself, with the volunteers. That is definitely something that's going to be key and will allow us to learn a lot, not only at a local national level in Argentina, but also regionally and globally. Because in the end, that's how we need to understand it, as dynamics that can actually be appreciated from the different dimensions we all live in, and they're not disconnected from one another. They're not detached. Now, okay, some lessons that we've also learned from that work that we did. Okay, we have a fair amount of lessons, but something good is that
we have a good amount of lessons. On the one hand, we need to guarantee that the humanitarian action is inclusive, to respond to the local context and also in the decision-making process of the migrant. That is something that we have to look into the context of migration action to be able to give a voice to the person that is being assisted. And it also aims towards processes that are intercultural, as we realize that the population that transits through countries or that choose our countries as a destination are people that come from different parts of the world. This year, we worked from last year to this year. We have been receiving people from Russia, Ukraine. We have worked with the Syrian population, and there's an enormous challenge to be able to integrate this population into the local community, into the context of our countries, among other things, because these are people that don't speak Spanish. Let's start by there. I won't take any longer. And to close, this is research that we consider interesting that could be developed in the future in the framework of the Worldwide Migration Lab. We consider it's interesting to be able to research the migration dynamics regionally, understanding that we have national societies regionally, and that the processes that the population, the migrating population lives, affects each one of our countries. Therefore, it would be interesting to be able to have that available in the future, to be able to work in that line of research, and to once again identify other needs of protection, because the migration dynamics change constantly, and to be able to work in integration processes to abandon the emergency assistance framework and start thinking of migration from the integration processes of the migrating population into our countries, their lives, their access to labor. That's an enormous challenge that we are facing, at least with the Venezuelan population, that is one of the largest migration flows that we receive the most currently throughout all the countries of Latin America. And finally, to set into perspective volunteering within migration, but not only within migration, there's something that I wish to somewhat leave on the table. We need to start to think of other ways of volunteering, which is not only the field work. I believe that the pandemic opened hundreds of labor possibilities in the virtual scenario. And we're not considering this at the moment in the work that could be carried out by volunteers from the National Society. We believe that is a bet that we need to work on to find a way in which people that wish to be volunteers can also support the Red Cross, the Red Cross's mission from virtual scenarios whenever possible, of course. Also understanding that the labor dynamics of the population are very complex, and even more so in our countries, I would dare to say. I wish to close with these comments and to thank once again the invitation.
Thank you so much, Felipe. There's such an incredible wealth of experience from the speakers who've presented today, and it's actually very humbling to be have the privilege of working in the lab, because we are trying to do some of the things Felipe was describing around support national societies to work collectively to design those strong research agendas, and also to think through how concretely we can bring volunteers into our research agenda to enable us to do some of the things that Felipe just described around capitalising on the information we already collect, because so much of the work in the humanitarian sector is about responding to emergencies and responding to things that that take up our immediate time and energy without the ability to step back and think strategically. So I have posted a request in the chat for any questions, but I see that there haven't been any posed yet. So I'm going to put Milena on the spot and say, from your perspective, coordinating this research project that involved strategic involvement, a strategic agenda around migration and trust, but also had a very clear objective to support national societies to involve volunteers and expand our capacity. What do you think is the main, or are the main things that national societies should be thinking about around this research model and our work with volunteers? Do you have any particular reflection that you want to leave us with?
I think the reflection would be more a collective reflection. I think what Jenny, Felipe, and Carlos pointed out, the need to have a pool of volunteers that may be ready to do research and that have been trained and have been provided with the support in flexible ways. I think what Felipe is saying is really true, that we have to be able to provide trainings in virtual ways. We have to be able to allow volunteers, if they want to and if they're able to engage in different stages of the research. So kind of having the flexibility for the volunteers while having the support, because I think that's the main thing. We cannot expect volunteers to just go on the field without having the training, without having the resources, and without having the debriefing at the end. So kind of both things, the flexibility and the support. And I think that's where we need to have a more movement conversation of how we have an integrated support for these volunteers. Also, so it's not dependent on an individual like Felipe or an individual like Jenny to provide that training, but that we have tools that are standardized, that are available in language, that are quality checked. So the onus doesn't fall on one volunteer or on one national society to provide that support.
And this is certainly, some of you may be aware that the Global Migration Lab is involved in developing the movement strategy on migration. And it's exactly in that area of drawing links between work that's happening in the migration space and work that's happening in the community engagement and accountability space, work that's happening around the importance of volunteering in the movement. One of the things we're hoping to do with the strategy is identify the connections between these different pieces of work happening in the movement so that we can standardize some of these processes. So there are some exciting conversations happening in that area. Carlos, please go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that the Migration Lab also leaves us an installed capacity in the National Society. Currently, we have many donors that are saying, I wish to contribute towards migration, and the report allowed us to be able to identify what each organization is moving forward with. How do migrants feel throughout the migration route? What can we do? What further needs are there? How are they treated? How to strengthen our migration teams? How the training processes to be able to work with each migrant? What are the protection issues, data? How to be able to have empathy with migrants? I think that has also being able allowed us to be able to identify this. And currently the Migration Lab and the report allowed us to have that clear view. So I also wanted to mention that.
Thank you so much, Carlos. It was also from our perspective, the ability of this type of research using volunteers to contribute to the national, the regional and the global, I think is really exciting for the use of this kind of model going forward. Do any of our speakers have any last thoughts they want to add? But while I'm waiting to see if any of you do, I'm just going to take the opportunity on behalf of the Global Migration Lab to thank you all for speaking today, and thank you all for joining today. And we'd love to hear from you. I will put the Global Migration Lab contact in the chat. We'd love to hear from you about the work that you're doing in your national societies, whether there are ways you'd like to get involved in research like this, if there are ways the lab can support your migration research, or continue the conversation about volunteers. I also want to thank our interpreters, Candela and Andrea, for their excellent work today, and thank you to 2M Translation Services for their ongoing support of the lab. And finally, thank you to the colleagues from the RC3 and French Red Cross Foundation, and in particular Louise, who put so much time and effort into making this session and the whole long night of research such a success and such an exciting program. Felipe, please go ahead.
There's something that I would wish to convey in order to close. I realized, well, I was in a meeting in Brazil with the National Society of the Southern Cone in Migration. This is something that we are recently doing for the first time ever in the region, in the Southern Cone, and I believe that this is an enormous debt that we have in the different components of the movement. And something that we didn't take advantage of, being such a large movement with presence in so many nations globally, not being articulated, not working as a network in the different fields of work, in a certain way, on the one hand, it leaves us blinded internally towards a movement, and on the other, it makes us lose sight of many work opportunities globally and to be able to reflect globally. I think that we have the skill set to do so, to be able to generate that articulation between the different components, and for the different fields, in this case of migrations, to be able to have more articulation, further and broader understanding of the issue, not the issue, of the matter in relation to migration. It's not a problem, it's a right in itself that any person has. So that is what I am betting on in each national society and all the components of the movement to keep on strengthening the work that the Red Cross has globally. This is an opportunity, this is a way to do so, but we need to keep on working in that regard over that construction of this network. And also based on the knowledge generation, because the amount of work that is done is enormous. It's not possible to quantify. The people that provide assistance to a migrant in the border is the tip of the iceberg of all the actions that we perform on a daily basis on the different fields in which we work. Therefore, that is something that we need to strengthen firmly, and we expect from the National Society to keep on working on research in different fields. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Felipe. Those are inspiring words and a real call to action for us all to keep working in this way. So thank you all for participating today. Thank you to our speakers, and please do join other events in the Long Night of Research, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Gracias por unir,
Bye.
estar aquí.